Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 686, and today is October 9th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We don't have a ton of news to get through on today's show. Might be a little bit of a shorter show today. We're still waiting to see what Israel and the U.S. are going to do in response to the Iranian missile barrage that hit Israel. So we're still waiting for that, and of course that will be a huge episode whenever that happens, and we'll have a lot to talk about then. But today we're just going to be talking about what the Americans are talking about when it comes to that attack. So important news on today's show nonetheless. Now, if you want to share the show, it's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. If you're a new listener to the show, subscribe to the show. If you want to watch the video version, we post it at YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. The show goes up at all three places, every single episode, same time every day. So if you prefer Rumble or Odysee over YouTube, which I kind of would rather my new subscribers head over there just for censorship reasons, especially as we get into election season here, head on over and subscribe. If you're an audio podcast listener, you don't miss very much. We do, show the articles we're talking about, occasionally maps or other pictures that may be helpful. But generally speaking, the audio audience gets everything out of the show that the video audience does as well. And you can subscribe anywhere you listen to your audio podcast. Ratings, reviews, shares, anything like that you could do, guys, to get the show out there to new people, recommend it to more people. I really do appreciate it. What keeps this show going is that we have listeners and usually new listeners adding to the base. And last, just a reminder to follow me on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_, nearing 7,000 followers now on Twitter. And I post all the shows that I do, all the articles that I write, anything that I think is important ends up on my Twitter feed. So that's a good place to go to follow my work. All right, let's get into it on today's show. And as I teased in the intro, the first story up here today, October 8th, Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. Report U.S. considers launching airstrike against Iran to support Israeli attack. The U.S. has discussed the idea of supporting Israel's expected attack on Iran with intelligence or with airstrikes of its own, NBC News reported on Tuesday, citing two unnamed U.S. officials. The report said that senior U.S. military officials had discussed launching, quote, very limited airstrikes against Iranian targets inside Iran or outside of the country, though the U.S. said intelligence support for Israel was more likely. So far, no final decision on U.S. action has been made, according to the report, and the U.S. official said Israel has not briefed the U.S. on what specific plans to strike Iran in response to the Iranian missile barrage that hit Israel last week. Iran launched nearly 200 ballistic missiles into Israel in response to multiple Israeli escalations in the region, including the July 31st assassination of Hamas's political chief Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, and then the assassination and the killing of Hezbollah leadership and IRGC commander, including Hassan Nasrallah. So the NBC News report said U.S. officials are worried Israel could launch its attack while the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant is meeting with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin at the Pentagon on Wednesday. However, after that report was published, Gallant's trip to the U.S. was canceled. Israeli media said the trip was postponed because Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wants to speak with President Biden and the Israeli Security Cabinet to agree on a plan to attack Iran before Gallant heads to Washington. The Israelis are considering several types of targets to hit Iran: military and intelligence infrastructure, air defense, energy facilities. Based on media reports, Israel does not plan to strike Iranian nuclear facilities in its first attack, but if Iran hits back and the situation turns into a full-blown war, Israeli officials think that will likely happen. So, a couple little bits of analysis I want to add on to this article. The first here is whenever the U.S. is considering doing something militarily, it's important to understand how the deep state or the intelligence, defense community, State Department, whoever it may be that are trying to persuade the president to do what they want. The strategy they usually use, to my understanding, is they present three options, and really only the middle one is the sensible one. The lower option is meant to, we can't do nothing, so we can't do that, so we have to at least do the middle option. And then the top option is so strong, it'll make the president feel like he's being a little bit conciliatory just not to take that. And so if option A is don't help Israel, option B is give Israel intelligence, logistical, other military support to pull off the attack, and option C is get involved in the attack ourselves by actually dropping bombs on Iran, well, then President Biden could pick option B and say, oh, well, this is the moderate escalation here. And of course, it is a quite severe escalation to help Israel carry out an attack inside Iranian territory. So I do wonder if that is maybe the strategy the intelligence community, deep state, is playing here. They are looking to hem Biden in on strategy by giving him three options, only one of which is really workable. Of course, if this plan is pursued, escalation is going to turn into a full-blown war with Iran, putting particularly the 2,500 American soldiers in Iraq, the 900 American soldiers in Syria, and then I would guess those soldiers would be in the most direct line of fire from Iran or other axis of resistance forces, including the Shia militias of Iraq and Syria, maybe even to some extent the Iraqi security forces. I mean, the Popular Mobilization Forces, the PMFs, which are the Shia militias, are a part of Iraq's security forces. Whenever the U.S. bombs the PMF, the Iraqi government puts out a statement saying that the U.S. bombed their own security forces there. But there is a noticeable difference between the PMFs and the Iraqi military. I guess it's probably less likely the Iraqi military gets involved in something like this, but once war breaks out in that country, it'll be hard to tamp down. Additionally, in Syria, it's the Shia militias. It's also Hezbollah that operates in the country, Iran that operates in that country, Russia that operates in that country. Look, I mean, it would seem absurd to me that Russia would say launch an attack in Syria against U.S. forces, but if Bashar al-Assad was interested in doing so to try to drive the Americans out, there's this additional interest in it because there's this whole regional war breaking out, then maybe that is a concern that the U.S. has to consider. And so I think there's a lot of potential consequences to being involved in this war to the extent that the U.S. is, should, it escalate to a full-blown war with Iran, is already concerning enough. But if we're carrying out these attacks, then that's major. What the U.S. needs to be doing here, of course, is pushing Israel to de-escalate and trying to ramp down the situation in the Middle East. But apparently there's absolutely no consideration for that at this point. And so I think that's a good time to get into our next story here. U.S. says it doesn't want ceasefire in Lebanon, supports Israeli offensive. So the State Department said Tuesday that it doesn't want to see a ceasefire in Lebanon and supports the heaviest Israeli bombardment of the country to degrade Hezbollah. The State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller was asked about comments from Hezbollah deputy Sheikh Naim Qassam, who said the group supports effort by the Lebanese parliament speaker Nabila Berri to reach a ceasefire without mentioning it must include a ceasefire in Gaza. So Miller told reporters, now that is Hezbollah on the back foot and is getting battered. Suddenly they've changed their tune and want a ceasefire. The U.S. ultimately wants a diplomatic solution, but Miller voiced strong support for the Israeli military operations, which has killed more than 1,250 people, including over 100 children, adding, we support Israel's efforts to degrade Hezbollah's capability. So the U.S. is also calling for Lebanon to hold new presidential elections amid the Israeli bombardment. Lebanon hasn't elected a president since 2022, as the many different factions in parliament haven't agreed to elect one. Hezbollah's political wing currently holds 15 seats in the nation's 128-seat parliament. And Miller said, what we want to see come out of this situation ultimately is Lebanon able to break the grip Hezbollah had on the country, break the stranglehold that Hezbollah has had over the country. Now, I think the problem with this is that Hezbollah represents a large swath of the Shia population in Lebanon. They're elected members of the government there. This isn't, just some group that's come in and forced themselves as the rulers of the Shia in Lebanon. It's because that they helped to drive the Israelis out of Lebanon a couple of times. That has really cemented their popularity within the country. And so, What Miller is actually saying here is what the U.S. wants to see is for the Shia to have less control in Lebanon, and that only will come through the Israeli bombardment, driving them, making them displace people, and things like that. It's extremely concerning. So the U.S. is still characterizing the Israeli assault on Lebanon as a, quote, limited incursion, despite the massive bombings in Beirut and across the country. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu signaled on Tuesday that more escalations were coming. In a threatening message to the people of Lebanon, he called for them to free the country of Hezbollah, or they will face destruction and suffering like we see in Gaza. Before Israel launched a strike that killed Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, the U.S. was calling for a temporary 21-day ceasefire, but the U.S. put no real pressure on Israel to accept the truce, since it provided a massive new military aid package, as Netanyahu rejected the idea of a ceasefire and then killed Nasrallah, who had agreed to the ceasefire. So obviously the U.S. doesn't want de-escalation in the Middle East. Now, the next article I want to talk about here is this one. Vice President Harris says Iran is the greatest U.S. adversary. This again from Dave DeCamp. So Vice President Kamala Harris was named as the top U.S. adversary, pointing to the recent Iranian missile attack on Israel when it came to multiple Israeli elections. When asked in her 60 Minutes interview which country she believed is the U.S. greatest adversary, Harris said, "I think there is an obvious one in mind, which is Iran." She continued, "Iran has American blood on their hands. And what we saw in terms of this attack on Israel, 200 ballistic missiles, what we need to do to ensure Iran achieves the ability to be a nuclear power, that is the highest of my priorities." Harris, when asked if she would take military action against Iran if she had proof the country had nuclear weapons, she responded, "I'm not going to talk about hypotheticals at this moment." While there is always much hype around Iran's nuclear program, which is strictly for civilian purposes, CIA Director William Burns acknowledged on Monday that there is no evidence Iran has decided to build a nuclear weapon, and we'll have more on that in a minute. Both Harris and former President Donald Trump are running the platforms of being supremely pro-Israel and hawkish on Iran. Trump said last week Israel should take the opportunity to strike nuclear facilities inside Iran, and criticized President Biden for cautioning against the idea. Harris's claim that Iran is the top U.S. adversary goes against the official line of the Biden administration that China is the greatest foreign threat facing the U.S. And now, so I think this question is almost kind of a setup for Kamala Harris, and in maybe a unhelpful way for the American people, because she doesn't know. Right? She hasn't read the national security strategy or even the bullet points from it, and probably has no real idea of where the U.S. deep state military industrial complex really wants to go to war next, and that they would probably put the order as China, Russia, North Korea, then Iran in the list of U.S. adversaries to deal with. 3 and 4 there could be swept. Iran could be ranked over North Korea, but they certainly wouldn't rank Iran over China or Russia. And so I think this is just Harris talking, that's what popped into her head at the moment. There was no real thought about it. I don't think it represents any real change in American policy should she get elected president. Harris is still took a hawkish tone with China, saying the U.S. must win the competition for the 21st century with China. When asked if she would defend Taiwan if it was attacked by China, Harris again said she wouldn't get into hypotheticals. So this is maybe the marginal advantage of Harris over Biden, is that sometimes she understands not to just start blabbing, and it's better to keep her mouth shut. Where Biden, there probably would have said, well, we would commit to defending Taiwan or something, and really, stoke tensions with China there. So the one thing that, all this has me questioning is, what is the thought process in the White House? I assume that the White House, led by Joe Biden, wants Vice President Kamala Harris to win the election in November. If I'm wrong about that assumption, then the rest of my analysis here really doesn't make sense. But assuming they do want her to win in November, then you have to imagine that they are planning on running her as a wartime president at this point. It seems that, this was probably the last of the opportunities to really try to hammer out a ceasefire deal that would see Israeli hostages return, the fighting in the Red Sea, and the fighting on Israel's northern border, and the genocide in Gaza, and the raids in the West Bank end before the November election. And if America is going to be embroiled in the Middle East during the November election, I just don't see the political landscape in America where that could potentially be helpful to Kamala Harris at all. And so I think this is a massive political blunder on the part of the president, the Democrats, to run the vice president in this way. However, in a sense, the Israelis haven't given them the option that they wanted, right? Where they want the Israelis to agree to a ceasefire and at the same time not complain that the Americans are imposing a ceasefire on them. And so while they could have done that, and I think it could have made Kamala, especially if she was the one to lead the effort there, look something like a strong leader and capable of de-escalating tensions in the Middle East, the U.S. has done the exact opposite. And so, just creating real messes here. All right, next up here, CIA says no evidence Iran has decided to build a nuclear weapon. So CIA Director Burns said on Monday that there's no evidence Iran has decided to build nuclear weapons, comments that came amid calls in the U.S. for Israel to strike Iranian nuclear sites. According to NBC News, Burns said, "No, we do not see evidence today that the Supreme Leader has reversed the decision that he took at the end of 2003 to suspend the weaponization program." So this is an admission that for the past 21 years, as nearly every elected American official has told the American people we must confront the Iranians to prevent them from getting a nuclear bomb, here the CIA director just told all of us that they're not even working on a nuclear bomb and have not been since 2001. So what has Benjamin Netanyahu, Donald Trump, Lindsey Graham, Chuck Schumer, Hillary Clinton, all these hots for years and years and years, for decades, right? For almost 2/3 of my life, these people have been telling me that Iran is making a nuclear weapon. And here comes William Burns, just walks out on stage and said, oh yeah, that 2003 fatwa that the Iranian Supreme Leader, the Ayatollah, issued prohibiting the development of nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction. Yeah, the Iranians are still committing to that. That's huge. That is the most important message that the American people should have been getting all along, that Iran is not trying to make nuclear weapons, and our intelligence community knows that for a fact. But nope, it goes completely under the radar, completely unreported, right? This is what should be fact checked. This is, that we have these debates that they call them between, Trump and Harris, or Waltz and Vance, and they're fact checking the candidates on stage to make sure they hold them to the truth. And then they'll say Iran's making nuclear, and nobody's going to bring up that the CIA director is saying that this is patently untrue. That's not going to get it's never going to get fact checked, because it would lower the temperature of a potential war, and the mainstream media doesn't want to do that. It's just, it's so frustrating, the whole situation around Iran's nuclear program. And I do worry that eventually Iran will abandon that fatwa and consider that the only way to save the Iranian society from the Israelis and the Americans is to have a nuclear deterrent. I'm not saying that Iran has made that decision, that they're going to soon. However, at some point, I think they will be pushed to that point, and that could happen. All right, next up here, this one from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. 7 civilians killed in Israeli airstrike on Damascus airport. So the Syrian Defense Ministry has reported that Israel carried out an attack on an apartment building in the residential neighborhood of Maza in the capital city of Damascus. At least 7 civilians, including women and children, were killed in the attack. They warned that the death toll is preliminary and they are still looking for other survivors in the rubble. Details of the incident are are still emerging, and the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights claims that the buildings were believed to be used by Hezbollah and the IRGC. 2 of the dead in the attack were described as foreigners and are yet to be identified. In addition to the people killed in the attack, 11 others were reported wounded. The bottom 3 floors of the building have been described as totally destroyed, and more than 20 parked cars near the area have been damaged. Maza is a relatively upscale suburb of western Damascus and is where many of the nation's embassies are located. Since Israel began its most recent escalation of strikes in Syria, they have hit this neighborhood multiple times. Israel has been engaged in a war on the Gaza Strip for over a year, and that war has expanded to include a ground invasion of Lebanon in recent weeks, along with escalating air wars against Syria and Yemen. Though there have been international efforts to broker some general ceasefire, there seems to be little momentum in that direction, and the conflict is increasing as time goes on. Israel has been attacking Syria on and off for many years, hitting targets in Damascus and elsewhere throughout the Syrian civil war. Though they maintained official neutrality throughout the conflict, though the strikes have come a few times a month, they have been attacking targets inside Syria nearly every day this week, reflecting growing regional tensions. All right, and we'll wrap it up with, I actually got 2 stories here on the war in Ukraine. The first one I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on October 8th. U.S. to loan Poland $3 billion to purchase helicopters. Washington has agreed to give Warsaw a $3 billion loan to buy American-made Apache helicopters. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the White House has lavished Poland with military assistance, loans to buy weapons, and billions in arms sales. The U.S. is set to use the Foreign Military Financing Program to give Poland a $3.8 billion loan to buy Apaches. Warsaw has received several FMF loans over the past year, now totaling $7 billion. Poland has played a critical role in the White House's proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. Washington has used Warsaw to funnel weapons to Kiev, and Ukrainian soldiers have been trained on Polish soil. Warsaw has been supportive of Washington's proxy war against Moscow and, at times, has pushed the White House to provide more military support to Ukraine. Under recent administrations, Washington has doled out billions of taxpayer dollars to several foreign nations to buy weapons from major American defense firms. The policy has tied the U.S. to crimes of multiple despots and enriched the large arms makers at the expense of the American taxpayer. Poland agreed to buy over 90 Apaches from Boeing earlier this year, totaling $10 billion. And one of the things about these loans is they don't always get repaid. Sometimes they end up getting forgiven by the U.S. government. And so again, the U.S. taxpayer is really on support for all or most of this. And it only goes to benefits the elites in Washington, D.C., in this case, those with ties to Boeing. All right, next up here. And also last up, this one from Dave DeCant, October 6th, antiwar.com. Ex-NATO Chief Stoltenberg says Ukraine should have been given more weapons before the Russian invasion. Jens Stoltenberg, the former Norwegian prime minister, stepped down as the head of NATO last week after 10 years in the position, leaving behind a raging proxy war and a shattered Ukraine that has no chance of regaining lost territory. In an interview with the Financial Times, Stoltenberg said his only regret was that NATO didn't provide Ukraine with more weapons before it should launch its invasion of February 2022. Stoltenberg said, "If there is anything I, in a way, regret and see much more clearly now, is that we should have provided Ukraine with much more military support earlier. I think we all have to admit, should we have given them more weapons pre-invasion?" Russia's primary motive for launching the invasion of Ukraine was NATO support for Ukraine and the country's potential future membership in the alliance, a fact that Stoltenberg acknowledged last year. In the years leading up to the invasion, the U.S. and NATO slowly increased military aid to Ukraine while being aware of the potential catastrophic consequences. Stoltenberg said, "Sending lethal weapons was a big discussion. Most allies were against that pre-invasion. They were afraid of the consequences." The U.S. provided Ukraine with the lethal aid under the Trump administration by sending Javelin anti-tank missiles. Stoltenberg said, "I'm proud of what we have done, but it would have been a great advantage if it started earlier. It could have even prevented the invasion or at least made it much harder for Russia to do what they have done." Stoltenberg also bragged about crossing Russian Vladimir Putin's red lines despite the risk of nuclear escalation. He said, I push for crossing all those so-called red lines that Putin put up and have crossed many of them, and he hasn't done anything. The reality is, if Putin wants to escalate with the use of weapons of mass destruction, he can create all the excuses he needs. So far, we have called his bluff. I mean, that's just absolute lunacy, and the type of lunacy that could get us all killed. All right, everybody, thank you all so much for tuning into the show today. We got 2 more shows coming out this week, so be sure you're subscribed to the show somewhere so you don't miss an episode.